Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers, and every single click counts. And today's deck is going to be focused on Kellan, Daring Traveler. For 1 colorless and 1 white, it's a legendary creature human fairy scout 2/3 with whenever Kellan Daring Traveler attacks, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card with mana value 3 or less, put it into your hand. Otherwise, you may put it into your graveyard. It also has Journey On for 1 green, which is a sorcery adventure that says create X map tokens, where X is 1 plus the number of opponents who control an artifact. So I must admit, I didn't even really pay a second glance at this card when it got spoiled, but after thinking about how much I've enjoyed my Taser deck and opening a copy of Kellan with the alternate art in a collector booster, I decided, hey, why don't I try to build a deck with what I've got lying around the house for the most part, and then add a couple of cards and see if it doesn't turn out to be quite fun. And it's looking really good, honestly. I'm really excited to test it out. I've ordered the couple of cards I'm missing and we'll be testing it out this week. The deck is built around tokens, map tokens in particular, and counters, and then we have a theme of returning creatures to hand. Particularly what we want to be doing is returning Kellan to hand so we can cast it again and get more map tokens. And that's going to be really cool because it's going to allow us to get some pretty decent card selection and grow our creatures at the same time. The deck is already fairly cheap in the first place, coming in at $150, but I will be recommending 3 budget substitutions that you can make, and with that, the deck goes down to $75, which is very reasonable. Anyway, without further ado, let's jump right in. And we're starting off with Anafenza Kintree Spirit. Because we're going to be bouncing creatures to hand, that means that we're going to get to trigger her bolster a lot after we replay them, and we can get quite a few counters on our creatures. Astrid Peth is going to work pretty well since we have a minor food sub-theme, and getting a bit more explore is already good in the deck since we have a lot of cards that synergize with exploring. Bygone Bishop is going to be really good. We're going to be bouncing our creatures to hand a lot, which allows us to recast them and trigger his ability, and seeing as most of our deck has mana value 3 or less, we're going to be investigating a lot. Cenote Scout is going to work pretty well with all of the exploring we're doing. It's just a cheap creature that we can draw with Kellan. Emancipation Angel is fantastic. It's got really good stats for its mana cost, and it allows us to bounce Kellan to hand to recast it or bounce any of our other ETB creatures. Farhaven Elf has a great ETB that's going to ramp us, and it feels really good to bounce it, particularly if we've blocked an opposing creature and then flash in something to get this back to hand. Fiend Hunter is excellent in this deck. We have a lot of instant ways to return stuff to hand, which means that we can do the classic combo of exiling something permanently with this. First Responder seems like it'll work really well because it's going to get bigger and bigger as we return creatures during our end step. That is going to allow us to reuse a lot of ETB effects, and it can even allow us to reuse Kellan if we want more map tokens, although it is a little bit slow to do so. Fleetfoot Panther works really well with all of their ETBs and our commander Kellan. It also has pretty decent stats for its cost. Jadelight Ranger is pretty good because exploring twice works very well with all of our explore synergy. Dumping stuff into the graveyard is another minor sub-theme of the deck, so we don't mind putting creatures in there if we get to reanimate them later. Jadelight Spelunker is a more flexible new version of Jadelight Ranger. You can dump as much mana as you want into this and get to explore a lot of times. Kami of Whispered Hopes is very good. We can make it explore with our map tokens to get extra counters on it, and that should allow it to tap for quite a bit of mana. Karametra, God of Harvest, works so well in this deck. We're a very low mana curve deck that hard casts creatures, so this is going to give us so much ramp. It's great. Kinjali's Dawn Runner can be really huge once we start putting counters on it, and exploring is just exactly what this deck wants. Kogla the Titan Ape works really well with our commander because we can make it indestructible by returning Kellan to hand, which then means we can recast Kellan's sorcery side. It's also just a very powerful card in its own right. Core Skyfisher is a decent option for bouncing stuff to hand. Do make sure you have a creature out so you don't end up having to bounce a land, which feels pretty bad. Mischievous Pup can protect any permanent, not only creatures, so that's why it gets the nod. It's very nice to save one of our important enchantments from removal with this. Here, Imaginative Rascal is going to make our exploring that much more powerful by putting 2 counters on our creatures instead of 1. Korean Beastcaller is going to trigger a lot because, again, we are hard casting a lot of creatures, and when it dies, we get to put its counters on things, which is really great. Reclamation Sage is a nice little bit of removal for artifacts or enchantments. Redemption Choir is one of the ways we can rebuy stuff from the graveyard. The fact that this happens on ETB if we have Coven makes it really strong because we immediately get something back, and then we can just keep getting value off of it when we keep attacking. It also has lifelink, which is very good as well. Regal Bunnycorn should be absolutely massive in this deck. It is just a vanilla creature, but it's a vanilla creature that can easily be a 12/12 or something with all of the map tokens and other stuff that we're going to be randomly making. Rescuer Chwinga is one of the best versions of this bounce effect because it's a maze, so it means we don't have to do it if we don't want to, and we also get to bounce any permanent, which means we can protect all of our stuff very well. Revelock is a classic card from Commander. We can either evoke it to get 2 things back immediately, or we can just cast it and wait for it to eventually leave the battlefield so we can get 2 things back. And as you've probably seen, most of our creatures have power 2 or less. Sakura Tribe Elder is another creature that's good to hard cast. It's just going to ramp us into something late game. We can also recur it with all of our recursion creatures. Samwise Gamgee is going to allow us to make quite a few food tokens. We do have a bit of synergy with artifact tokens, but he provides a payoff by himself by allowing us to get historic things back from our graveyard. So in Steel Seeker is going to be one of the best cards of the deck because it's kind of got an effect similar to Explore whenever an artifact enters the battlefield. We can either just draw a bunch of lands or we can start putting things into our graveyard to dig for other stuff. It's very strong. Sentinel of the Nameless City has amazing stats for its cost and also immediately provides us a map token and then 1 more each time it attacks. That's a huge amount of value. Serra Paragon should be amazingly strong in this deck because we get to play a thing from our graveyard every single turn. That's a lot like Lurrus, which is a very powerful card, but the thing is we can actually bypass the downside of this card because we have a lot of ways to bounce the things we return to hand, which means they'll never hit the graveyard. Shepherd of the Flock is a really good card as an adventure by giving us another way to protect something, and then it's a decent creature on the other side. Silverback Elder is going to pull a lot of work with all of the creatures that we're going to be hard casting, so it can either provide removal for artifacts or enchantment, or ramp, or just gain us some life if we need it to. It also has incredible stats. Stonecloaker is a classic in these kind of decks. It provides a nice little bit of graveyard hate and a way to repeatedly trigger your ETB abilities if you want it to. It can also just be protection if need be, and it's got decent stats as well as everything else. Sun Titan is going to be able to rebuy almost every card from the deck from the graveyard, which provides great recursion. So Ginger the Meal Ender is going to get quite big, and Scry, which works very well with our Explore abilities since we're going to be sacrificing a lot of map tokens and stuff like that. Teething Wormlet should almost always have Death Touch in this deck, but we want it mostly to gain life whenever an artifact enters the battlefield and for it to grow every turn. It'll take a while to get big, but it provides a lot of value as a 1-drop. It's also super cute. Temur Sabertooth gives us a great way to return our creatures to hand and also recast our commander, and it can randomly survive board wipes, which is great. Cheshire Ancestors Apostle is again going to be able to reanimate almost every card in this deck, and we do have quite a few legendaries and artifacts. Topography Tracker is going to do a lot of work in this deck. It's going to allow us to explore an extra time whenever we explore, and makes a map token on ETB. Not only that, but it can be reanimated by every reanimate effect in the deck, including Revelock since it has 2 power. Troublemaker Oof is a card that would usually not be great, but since we're making so many tokens, and since this is a cast effect and we're bouncing stuff to hand, this is just a really good way to repeatedly deal with artifacts or enchantments, and it exiles them, which is very good. White Mane Lion is another classic way to return our permanents to hand. Wildgrowth Walker should get very big and gain us a lot of life in this deck since we're going to be doing a ton of exploring. Wilfred Mott does a similar thing to what Kellan does. It's basically going to look at progressively more cards from the top of our library, and if it's a permanent card with mana value 3 or less, we're going to get to put it onto the battlefield. And since most of our deck is permanents mana value 3 or less, this should trigger a lot. Wood Elves is a great way to ramp that can be rebought for even more ramp. And Yoshin Dissident is very solid with all of the artifacts that we're going to be creating. It can grow our team surprisingly fast. Moving on to sorceries, we have Austere Command, which is particularly good in this deck, seeing as the vast majority of our creatures have mana value 3 or less. If we find ourselves in a situation where our opponents have a board with more expensive creatures, we can make this into a one-sided board wipe. Over the Edge is nice because both modes are very solid in this deck. Exploring twice is really good, but also being able to destroy an artifact or enchantment works well. Teferi's Protection is there to make sure we don't get blown out by board wipes, but it is a fairly expensive card, so if you want to substitute it for something else, I would suggest Inspiring Call. We are going to have a lot of counters on our creatures, and this can also draw us cards. Moving on to artifacts, we have Cloudstone Curio, which works very nicely because it's a way to repeatedly bounce stuff to our hand. It's also a May ability, which means we don't have to do it. Unfortunately, it is still quite an expensive card, so I would suggest substituting it for Samwise the Stout-Hearted. It's just another way to bounce stuff to your hand. Obviously, it's not as good as Cloudstone Curio, but it is going to cost you a tiny fraction of the price. Next up, we have Genesis Chamber, which is very powerful for a couple of reasons. First, you're going to be triggering it a lot and getting a lot of tokens out of this, which is nice if you're going to be going wide. But not only that, it also guarantees that our opponents have an artifact, which means that Kellan's Journey On is going to be that much more effective. Glowcap Lantern is a nice equipment that's going to allow us to look at the top card of our library and explore, which works very well. This means that if we have multiple explores triggers, we can stack them in the way that is most beneficial for us. Tarian's Soul Cleaver is going to be very nice because we are making a lot of artifacts that can be put into the graveyard. It's just a good way to provide us some insurance. cards. And Treasure Map works very nicely by giving us scries, which are obviously great with Explore, and then it's eventually going to transform into a way for us to draw 3 cards. Just very solid. Moving on to enchantments, we have Aura Shards, which is going to work very well with all of the creatures we're playing. City of Death provides us an initial treasure token that can be used for Treasure Map, but then during the next 5 turns, it's going to provide us another copy of either a map token or a treasure or whatever we have lying around that we would like to have more of. Doubling Season is in this deck because we are actually working with both counters and tokens, so it's very good. It is very expensive and difficult to substitute for. I recommend substituting it for Hardened Scales. That can effectively double the counters we're getting, since we're mostly getting counters in 1 increment, so it works really well even though we don't get the token aspect of Doubling Season. Meticulous Excavation is yet another way to bounce things to hand. Do be aware that you can only do this during your turns, but other than that, it's just a good way to return Kellan to hand or to return any other ETB creature that you want to be able to trigger again. Next up, we have Path of Discovery. This is going to allow our creatures to explore every time they enter the battlefield. That is a lot of good triggers, and that's going to work very well with a lot of our synergy pieces. We also have Tocasia's Welcome, which again is going to draw us quite a few cards, particularly since we have a lot of flash creatures that we're looking to play during our opponent's turn. Finally, we have Twists and Turns, which is great because it's going to allow us to scry before we explore, thus making it much more likely that we hit what we want. It also comes with a free explore when we play it, so that's a lot of value already for 1 mana. Then eventually it's going to flip, although I really wish that it didn't flip because in this deck the front side is better than the back, but the back side is going to allow us to dig for creatures, which is not bad. Finally, moving on to lands, we have Gavony Township, which is a great way to buff all of our board and can be one of the main finishes in the deck. We're also running Ghost Quarter, which is a way to deal with our opponent's problem lands, which is always good to have. And Khan's Bastion is going to allow us to proliferate, thus growing our team and making them that much more menacing. So there you have it. That has been my Kellan Daring Traveler deck tech. If you've followed this channel for a while, you probably know that I've never really made a proper Selesnya deck. That's because I never find them that interesting in the first place, but this one has kind of got me excited. I'm really looking forward to playing this and seeing how it works out, because it's so different from other Selesnya decks I've seen in the past. What do you think? Do you think there's any cards I missed or anything I shouldn't have included? Would you build this in a different way yourself? Let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.